The smell of urine and despair still permeated the air when I found Minjun's body in the apartment in Gamcheon-dong. His eyes were wide open in eternal terror, his mouth open in a silent scream that would never be heard. His fingernails had torn pieces of skin from his face, deep red marks that told the story of his last moments. On the table beside him lay a suicide note scribbled in trembling hands. "The nightmares won't stop. She won't let me sleep. Please forgive me." I smiled as I read, feeling the familiar tingling sensation on the tattoo on my neck. The crescent. Moon still pulsed with a faint violet glow, remnants of last night's delicious meal. Minjun had been a particularly tasty feast. His fears were so pure, so genuine. The terror of being buried alive that he had carried since childhood became my playground for 3 consecutive weeks. Each night I delved deeper into his mind, creating tunnels that collapsed, coffins that closed, dirt entering his mouth and nostrils as he screamed for help that would never come. "Perfect," I murmured, taking a photo with my cell phone. Hiroshi would be proud. This was our 13th success in Busan, and I had been feeling particularly hungry lately. My name is Kim Yuna, I am 20 years old, and I am what people would call a monster, if they knew what I really am. But I prefer to think of myself as an artist, a sculptor of nightmares, an architect of terror. And my art? Destroying human lives one mind at a time. I left Minjun's apartment through the back, descending the rusty iron stairs that led to the labyrinthine alleys of Gamcheon-dong. The colorful houses of the cultural village contrasted grotesquely with the rot I knew existed behind the cheerful facades. It was the perfect place for someone like me, a city where art and death walked hand in hand, where tourists took smiling selfies just feet away from where I cultivated my gardens of despair. Hiroshi was waiting for me at our usual meeting place, a 24-hour cafe tucked away in a narrow alley, frequented only by night workers and chronic insomniacs. When he saw me, his honey-colored eyes lit up with that familiar gleam, not of love, but of scientific fascination. It was as if I were a rare discovery he had been studying for years without ever growing tired. "How did it go?" he asked, in a low voice, motioning for me to sit down. He had already ordered my favorite coffee, triple Americano, no sugar. He knew me better than I knew myself sometimes. "Transcendental," I replied, feeling my eyes darken involuntarily at the memory. He tried to stay awake for 72 hours using amphetamines. He thought he could avoid me. I laughed softly, a sound that made the waiter behind the counter visibly shiver. Poor thing didn't understand that the more tired he got, the easier it was for me to get in. Hiroshi leaned forward, his fingers intertwined in a pose I recognized. It was his scientific analysis position. "Describe the final stages. I want every detail." And I described it. I told him how I found the crack in Minjun's mind when he was 7, accidentally buried by older children in a game that almost turned tragic. How I turned that memory into a paralyzing obsession. How, night after night, I dragged him into deeper and deeper tunnels in his dreams, making him feel the earth pressing down on his lungs, the oxygen running out, the absolute darkness closing in around him. On the last night, I continued, savoring each word, I made him see his own funeral, his parents crying over the coffin, saying how he had wasted his life. And then, I paused dramatically. The coffin opened, it was empty. Because he had never really existed. Hiroshi's eyes lit up. Existential nihilism combined with primal terror. Brilliant. He pulled a small digital recorder from his pocket. "May I?" I nodded. It was our ritual. Each case was meticulously documented. Analyzed, filed away. Hiroshi kept detailed records of all our creations. He said we were making art, that we were pioneers in a new form of human expression. I just liked how people looked when they were broken. "Kim Yuna, case number 13, he said into the recorder. "Victim, Park Minjun, 34, retired accountant due to stress. Method, systematic exploitation of traumatic childhood claustrophobia. Duration, 21 days. Result, suicide by intentional overdose of anti-anxiety medication." He paused. "Any special observations?" "The progression was exponential," I replied, closing my eyes to better relive the experience. In the early days, he still tried to rationalize it. "They're just nightmares," he would say to himself. But in the second week, I smiled. In the second week, he started digging holes in his backyard, looking for a way out that didn't exist. Hiroshi turned off the recorder and put it away. "We have a problem," he said, changing his tone completely. "The police are starting to connect the dots." I felt my tattoo tingle, not from hunger, but from irritation. Impossible. They were all classified as suicides. Yes, but there's a pattern. Detective Lee Dong-sik is investigating. And there's more. He hesitated, which was rare. Hiroshi never hesitated. "There's an exorcist asking questions. An old man named Choi. Traditional. The kind who really understands things like you." My hand involuntarily went to the tattoo on my neck. The exorcist Choi. I had heard whispers about him in the supernatural circles of Busan. A man who could see through disguises, who knew the signs of what I really was. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "That maybe it's time to consider a change of scenery. Seoul has a lot more opportunities and anonymity. Seoul, the megalopolis where I could lose myself among millions of minds, where urban nightmares were infinitely richer and more complex." The idea was tempting, but it also meant leaving behind 8 years of meticulous work in Busan. 8 years building our reputation, perfecting our techniques. "Not yet," I decided. "We have time, and I have plans." Hiroshi raised an eyebrow, his way of asking without speaking. "Remember our list of special targets? Judge Park, psychiatrist Dr. Yoon, businessman Kang?" My eyes darkened completely now, turning into those black pits that appeared when I was really hungry. "I want them all before we leave. A grand finale." "Yuna." Hiroshi sounded almost concerned. "These aren't ordinary targets. They're influential people with protection. If something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," I interrupted, my voice taking on that hypnotic tone I used when I needed people to agree with me. "Trust me. When we're done with them, Busan will remember us forever." Hiroshi studied me for a long moment. I could see the gears turning in his mind, calculating risks, analyzing probabilities. That was what I loved about him. He wasn't like other humans, ruled by emotion and instinct. He was pure intellect, cold and sharp as a surgical blade. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this right, methodically, and at the first sign of real trouble, we're out of here." I smiled, feeling the tattoo throb in approval. Of course. When did I ever tell you I didn't do everything right? But even as I spoke, a dark part of my mind whispered that maybe this time would be different. That maybe I was finally ready to find out how far my powers could take me. And if that meant leaving Busan and maybe even Hiroshi in flames behind me, well, that would just be another masterpiece for my collection. After all, every artist needs to evolve. And I was starting to feel very, very hungry for evolution. 3 days after our meeting at the cafe, I was following my next target through the busy streets of the Jagalchi market. Judge Park Sung-ho walked with the confidence typical of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. Shoulders straight, stride steady, gaze fixed ahead as if the people around him were mere obstacles in his path. At 52, he was known for his harsh sentences and the relentless reputation he had built over 2 decades in the judiciary. But I knew things about Judge Park that no one else knew. Secrets that Hiroshi had meticulously collected during weeks of surveillance and investigation. How he woke up every night at 3:33 a.m., sweating cold and whispering the name Young-hee. How he kept a bottle of sleeping pills hidden behind the law books in his office. How his hands trembled imperceptibly whenever he saw small children playing in the street. Young-hee had been his younger sister, 8 years old when she disappeared during a family outing in the Jirisan Mountains 40 years ago. Her body was never found. The family never recovered. And Park Sung-ho never stopped blaming himself for being the older brother who should have protected her. Perfect. I followed him to his house, a traditional Hanok property in the Donggu district, surrounded by high walls and security cameras. Not that the cameras could detect me when I really didn't want to be seen. It was one of the advantages of not being completely human. Conventional technology rarely worked properly in my presence. I waited until he fell asleep. At 11:47 p.m., for the third night in a row, I positioned myself outside his bedroom window and closed my eyes, letting my consciousness expand, searching for the specific frequency of his sleeping mind. Finding the path to someone's dreams was like tuning an old radio. You turned the dial until you heard the right static, until you felt that click of connection. With Judge Park, the static tasted like guilt and smelled like rotting leaves in the forest. When I opened my eyes, I was on Jerison Mountain, but not the real version. This was the version that lived in Park's tormented mind. Trees that twisted like arthritic fingers, trails that changed direction when you weren't looking, and a constant echo of children's laughter coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Appa, Appa, where are you? Jung-hee's voice echoed through the trees, exactly as Park remembered it. Sweet, confident, totally dependent on her older brother. I smiled. This was going to be fun. I started slowly, as always. On the first night, I just intensified the elements that were already there. The trees bent a little more menacingly. The laughter became slightly more distorted. The trail seemed to narrow just enough to make Park feel claustrophobic. Jung-hee, he shouted in his dream, his voice echoing with the desperation of decades of regret. Jung-hee, where are you? I'm right here, Appa, I replied, taking the form of his dead sister. It was easy. I had studied photographs of her, home videos that Hiroshi had obtained through questionable contacts. I appeared among the trees wearing the same floral dress she had worn on the day she disappeared, but now torn and dirty. My eyes, her eyes, were glassy and lifeless. Park ran toward me, tripping over roots that hadn't been there seconds before. Jung-hee, thank God I found you. Let's go home. I can't go home, Appa, I said in her voice, but letting a trace of my own malice seep through the edges. You left me here. You abandoned me. No, I looked for you. I never stopped looking. Liar. The word came out as a hiss. You told me to wait on the trail while you helped Dad with the tent. You said you'd be back in 5 minutes. But you got distracted, didn't you? You saw that pretty girl in the hiking group and completely forgot about me. Park recoiled, his face contorted in agony. It was true. At 12 years old, he had been distracted for maybe 10 minutes, impressed by a long-haired teenager who smiled at him. When he returned to look for Jung-hee, she was gone. I was just a kid too, he whispered, and I was your responsibility. With that, I let the dream unravel, yanking it roughly from the mountain of nightmares and throwing it back into the reality of his dark room. I heard him scream through the window, a strangled sound of pure guilt. One night. One of many to come. Over the next few days, I established a routine. During the day, I watched Park from afar, studying how my nighttime attacks affected him. It was fascinating to see such a powerful man slowly break down. He began canceling important hearings. His hands shook visibly during trials. Colleagues commented on the deep circles under his eyes. At night, I returned to his dreams, each time more cruel, more creative. On the second night, Jung-hee was decomposing, worms crawling out of her eyes. On the third, she blamed him directly for the death of her parents, who had died years later in a car accident, but in the dream it was because they never recovered from the loss of their daughter. On the fourth night, I showed him dozens of children he had sentenced to orphanages, all with Jung-hee's face, all accusing him of hypocrisy. How dare you judge others, they sang in unison, when you couldn't even protect your own sister. It was during the fifth night that Hiroshi showed up at my apartment with an expression I rarely saw, genuine concern. We need to talk, he said, closing the door behind him and double-checking the locks. I'm busy, I replied, not taking my eyes off the notebook where I was researching psychiatrist Dr. Yoon. Park is almost ready. A few more nights and he'll be ours. Yuna. Hiroshi's voice had that tone he used when he was trying not to sound alarmed. Detective Lee has been asking questions. Specific questions. I finally looked up at him. What kind of questions? About disturbed sleep patterns prior to the suicides. About nightmares reported by the victims. Families. He sat down across from me, his hands clasped together. And there's more. Exorcist Choi visited Minjun's family yesterday. He asked about Supernatural presences. I felt my tattoo tingle, not with pleasure, but with something that could be described as anxiety if I were capable of feeling normal emotions. So what? Bereaved families always look for supernatural explanations. It's basic psychology. He also asked specifically about young Asian women seen in the vicinity of the victims' homes in the days leading up to the deaths. That made me pause. I had been careful, but not invisible. It was impossible to be completely invisible when you needed to be physically close to your victims to access their dreams. They have nothing, I said, more to convince myself than him. These are just suspicions. Maybe, but there's something else. Hiroshi pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. It was me, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, walking away from the back of Minjun's building. The quality was poor, grainy, but it was undeniably me. This photo was taken by a curious neighbor on the night of Minjun's death. He handed it to the police yesterday. My blood, if I still had any running through my veins, froze. How did you get this? I have contacts at the police station, people who owe me favors. He put his phone away. Yuna, they're closing in. If they connect you to the other cases, then we kill the detective, he said simply, and the exorcist. Problem solved. Hiroshi looked at me as if I had suggested we fly to the moon. Killing authorities isn't like our artistic projects. That would bring national federal attention, investigators from Seoul, maybe even international. So what are you suggesting? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. That we finish park tonight and leave, immediately. I have fake IDs ready, money in offshore accounts. We can be in Seoul tomorrow morning and disappear completely. I looked out the window of my apartment, watching the lights of Busan spread out like an earthly constellation. 8 years. 8 years building my reputation, perfecting my art. The idea of running away like a common criminal angered me deeply. No, I said finally. I'm not running away. Not yet. Yuna. 1 week, I interrupted. Give me 1 week. I'll finish off Park Dr. Yoon and Businessman Kang. 3 high-profile targets that will make my name echo for generations. After that, if you still want to leave, we'll leave. Hiroshi studied me with those honey-colored eyes that seemed to see right through me. It was one of the few times I felt like the subject of study instead of the observer. What if they catch you before then? I smiled, letting my eyes darken completely. Then they'll find out what really happens when someone tries to hunt the Queen of Shadows. The tattoo on my neck pulsed with violet light, as if agreeing with me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered that maybe it was time to find out exactly what I was capable of when cornered. After all, until now, I had only been playful. Judge Park's body was found the next morning, hanging in his own study, a rope made of judicial ties tied to the ornate chandelier. The suicide note, written in his own shaky handwriting, confessed to decades of guilt over his sister's death and asked for forgiveness for all the unjust sentences he had handed down to compensate for my own moral failure. I watched from afar as the police cordoned off the scene, feeling that delicious rush of power coursing through my veins. The tattoo on my neck still throbbed faintly with the last traces of his tormented essence. It had been a magnificent meal, 40 years of guilt distilled into pure terror. But my moment of satisfaction was interrupted when I saw 2 familiar figures approaching the judge's house. Detective Lee Dong-sik, a thin man in his 40s with tired but intelligent eyes, was walking alongside a figure that made my blood run cold. A stooped old man wearing traditional Korean clothing and carrying an ornate staff. The exorcist, Choi. Even from a distance, I felt a strange energy emanating from the old man. It was as if he were a black hole sucking in the darkness around him, a presence that made my skin tingle uncomfortably. When he looked in my direction, through the crowd, through the parked cars, through all the obstacles, our eyes met for a split second. He saw me. He really saw me. I instinctively backed away, blending into the crowd of onlookers, but not before seeing his lips move in silent words that seemed to burn the air between us. When I got home, I found Hiroshi waiting for me with an expression I had never seen before. genuine fear. "They're moving faster than we thought," he said, closing all the curtains in the apartment. Detective Lee convinced his superiors to form a task force, and the exorcist... He hesitated. The exorcist got official permission to investigate supernatural activities related to the suicides? Impossible, I muttered, but my voice sounded less convincing than I intended. The Korean police don't believe in... They do now. 14 suicides in 6 months, all preceded by reports of extreme nightmares, all involving methods that perfectly mirror the victim's deepest fears. Hiroshi showed me a digital file on his tablet. Lee is smarter than we gave him credit. 4. He's made connections that shouldn't be possible for a purely rational mind. I flipped through the file, feeling a chill that could have been anxiety if I were capable of normal human emotions. There were detailed maps showing the locations of all the deaths, precise timelines, even psychological profiles of the victims. And at the end, a section titled Anomalous Patterns that described my methods with disturbing accuracy. "How did he get this?" I asked. "He has consultants, psychiatrists, sleep specialists, even a cultural anthropologist who studies Korean supernatural folklore." Hiroshi's voice was tense. "And they've all come to the same conclusion. There's something non-human causing these deaths." I closed the tablet harder than necessary, cracking the screen. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in. For the first time in 8 years, I was being hunted by people who truly understood what I was. "We have to speed up our plans," I said, heading for my closet. "Dr. Yoon and businessman Kang. I'm going to get them tonight." "Yuna, no!" Hiroshi stood up abruptly. "That's exactly what they're waiting for. They probably already have surveillance on the potential targets." "Then what do you suggest? That we run like scared rabbits?" "I suggest we be smart. That we recognize when we're outmatched and..." My hand was around his neck before he could finish the sentence. Not hard enough to hurt him, Hiroshi was too precious to me, but hard enough to make him understand that I meant what I said. "Never," I hissed, my eyes darkening completely, "never again use the word outmatched when referring to me. I am the Queen of Shadows. I am not outmatched by pathetic humans who play detective." I let go of him and he stepped back, rubbing his neck. For the first time since we had met, there was something in his eyes that could have been fear. Not fear of me specifically, but fear of what I could become if pushed too far. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment. "You're right. Just be careful." I slipped into my favorite black dress, silk that flowed like liquid shadows, and pinned my hair into a low bun. Tonight would be different. Tonight, I would show them exactly who they were dealing with. Dr. Kim Yuna lived in a luxury apartment in Haeundae, overlooking the beach. As a psychiatrist specializing in sleep disorders, she would be a deliciously ironic target. Her area of expertise was precisely what I used as a weapon. But when I arrived at her building, I found something that made me pause. There were symbols, discreetly carved into the concrete around the entrance, symbols I recognized as traditional Korean protections against evil spirits. And in the lobby, a security guard who definitely hadn't been there the week before when I had done my initial reconnaissance. The exorcist had arrived first. I climbed the service stairs, my footsteps silent as always, but the feeling of being watched grew with each floor. On the 15th floor, where Dr. Yoon had her apartment, I found more symbols. This time, they were paper talismans discreetly stuck to the walls, almost invisible but emanating an energy that made my skin burn. When I tried to approach her door, a searing pain shot through my head. It was as if someone were sticking red-hot needles behind my eyes. I recoiled, gasping, realizing with growing horror that I was being blocked, physically prevented from approaching my prey. Impressive, isn't it? A calm voice came from the shadows at the end of the hallway. Exorcist Choi slowly emerged, leaning on his ornate staff. "Joseon Dynasty containment seals. Very effective against your... kind." I tried to assume a casual posture, hiding the pain that still throbbed in my head. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir. I just came to visit a friend." He laughed, a dry sound like dead leaves. "Kim Yuna. Born in 2005 in Daegu. Parents died when you were 12, officially from simultaneous heart complications, but the paramedics reported expressions of terror they had never seen before. His eyes, despite his age, were sharp as blades. That's when you discovered your powers, isn't it? When you realized you could feed off the nightmares of others? My mask of normality finally slipped. You don't know anything about me. I know more than you think. I know you're not entirely human. I know your true nature only emerges fully during the new moon. I know that every soul you devour makes you stronger, hungrier. He took a step forward, and I instinctively backed away. And I know there's something much bigger than you interested in your talents. What are you talking about? The entity that whispers in your ear when you're on the threshold between sleep and wakefulness. The voice that promises you unlimited power if you just abandon your remaining humanity. His eyes narrowed. She's been talking to you lately, hasn't she? My blood froze. He knew. Somehow this old man knew about the voices I heard in my darkest moments, when I was most deeply connected to the world of nightmares. Voices that promised to teach me ancient secrets, to offer me power beyond human imagination. Voices I had ignored because Hiroshi was enough. Our partnership was enough. But lately, especially after the Park case, the voices were getting more insistent. You're delusional, old man, I said, trying to sound dismissive. Am I? Then why is your tattoo throbbing more intensely now? Why can I feel the hunger growing inside you like a tumor? He raised his bat, and symbols I couldn't read began to glow along its surface. And why haven't you tried to enter my mind yet, little nightmare? Are you afraid of what you might find there? The truth was, I had tried. The moment I saw him, I had instinctively attempted to probe his mind, searching for fears I could exploit. But his mind was like a fortress, not just protected, but actively hostile to my presence. As if he had spent decades preparing specifically for this confrontation. The choice is yours, he continued. You can come with me willingly. Help us understand your nature, perhaps even find a way to coexist peacefully. Or you can continue down this path and find out what happens when forces far greater than you decide you've become a threat. Greater forces? My voice came out as a growl. The entity that has been whispering to you is not the only one of its kind. And not all of them have artistic intentions. Some simply want to see the world burn. He turned to leave, but paused. Think carefully, Kim Yuna. The next time we meet, it may not be so civilized. With that, he disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, leaving only the echo of his staff tapping on the floor and the smell of ancient incense in the air. I stood alone in the hallway, surrounded by symbols that burned against my skin, realizing with growing horror that the Yao game had changed completely. It was no longer about hunting defenseless prey. Now I was the prey. And somewhere in the back of my mind, an ancient, seductive voice whispered, "It's time, my dear. It's time to discover who you really are." I returned home in a state of shock, my mind reeling from the exorcist's revelations. Hiroshi was waiting for me with a bottle of soju and 2 cups, a pathetic attempt at normalcy amid the chaos our life had become. But when I told him about my encounter with Choi, I saw something I had never seen before in his eyes. Absolute terror. He knows about the entity, he whispered, his hands shaking as he poured the alcohol. Yuna, if he really knows about this... What entity? I lied, though my heart was racing. The voices that whispered during my darkest moments weren't just a figment of my imagination. They were real, and apparently dangerous enough to scare even Hiroshi. Don't lie to me, he said, his voice taking on that clinical tone he used when analyzing one of our cases. I know you better than you know yourself. I've seen the signs over the last few weeks. You talking to yourself when you think I'm not listening, your eyes darkening for no apparent reason, that insatiable hunger that only gets worse with each victim. I turned to the window, unable to face him. They're just whispers. Nothing more. Whispers of what? Of power, of possibilities, of how I could be so much more than I am now, if only... I stopped, realizing I was revealing too much. If only what, Yuna? If only you would free me from human limitations. The words came out in a whisper, as if saying them aloud would make them more real. The voice says I can become something beyond humanity, beyond the need to hunt one mind at a time. It promises everything. Hiroshi was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with a sadness that cut me deeper than any weapon. And you want that, don't you? The question hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Because the answer was yes. God help me, the answer was yes. Every night, the voice grew more seductive, more convincing. It promised a power that would make my current games seem like child's play. A world where I wouldn't have to hide, where I could rule openly over the nightmares of millions. I don't know, I lied again. But it was too late. Hiroshi knew me too well. He saw the truth in my eyes, in the way my tattoo throbbed with involuntary anticipation. He saw that I was already seriously considering the entity's offer. So that's it, he said, standing up abruptly. 8 years. 8 years creating art together, and you're willing to throw it all away for promises from a creature that doesn't even know what it really is? Hiroshi, it's not like that. No? Then look me in the eyes and tell me you never thought of abandoning me. Tell me that our partnership means more to you than infinite power. I opened my mouth to lie again, but the words wouldn't come out, because he was right. In the last few weeks, especially after each meal, I found myself wondering what it would be like not to need him, what it would be like to be truly free, truly powerful. Silence was his answer. I understand, Hiroshi said, his voice now cold and distant. Then maybe it's time for me to make my own decisions. He headed for the door, but I intercepted him. Where are you going? To do what I should have done weeks ago. His honey-colored eyes, which had always looked at me with scientific fascination, were now hard as stone. I'm going to talk to Detective Lee. My world collapsed. You wouldn't do that. I would, and I will. He moved closer, and for the first time in 8 years, I backed away from him. You've forgotten that I'm just as much of a monster as you are, Yuna. The difference is that I know when to stop. Hiroshi, please. No, you made your choice. Now I'm making mine. He left, leaving me alone in the apartment that suddenly seemed cold and empty. The reality of what had just happened hit me like a punch in the stomach. Hiroshi wasn't just abandoning me, he was betraying me, turning me into the authorities. The voice whispered immediately in my mind, seductive and comforting. See? Humans always betray. They always disappoint. But you're not human, my dear. You don't need them. Shut up, I muttered, but without conviction. Accept my offer. Become my true daughter. And you'll never be hurt again, never abandoned. Felt tears, real tears, streaming down my face. When was the last time I cried? When was the last time I felt anything other than hunger and sadistic satisfaction? 2 hours later, my phone rang. Detective Lee. Miss Kim? I'd like you to come down to the station for a chat. We have a few questions about your nighttime hobbies. I hung up without answering. They knew. Hiroshi had really turned me in. I ran to the window and looked out onto the street. Police cars were approaching from all sides, surrounding my building. In the middle of them, I recognized the hunched figure of the exorcist Choi, now accompanied by other men wearing traditional clothing and carrying equipment I couldn't identify. I was trapped. Last chance, whispered the voice. Accept my offer now, or be captured like a common animal. I closed my eyes, feeling decades of isolation, betrayal, and pain crystallizing into a decision that would change everything. What do you want from me? I asked aloud. The temperature in the apartment plummeted instantly. The lights flickered and went out. And then, in the absolute darkness, a presence materialized before me. Not visible, but tangible as a mountain. Of pure malice. Simple, my child. I want you to accept your true nature. To stop playing at being human and become what you were born to be. And what am I? A primordial nightmare. One of the first creatures born of humanity's collective fears. You are not just someone who manipulates nightmares. You are the nightmare. The ancient fear that lives deep within the mind of every human being. The words rang through me like a bell, awakening memories I didn't know I had. Images of ancient times, of entire civilizations terrorized by creatures like me, of endless nights where we ruled over the dreams of millions. Why now? I asked. Because the time has come for our species to reclaim its place. Humans have become too numerous, their minds too connected. If you accept my offer, you will be able to feed not on one mind at a time, but on millions simultaneously through their digital networks. The vision was tempting beyond comprehension. No longer hunting stealthily in the shadows, but ruling openly over the nightmares of all humanity. But then I thought of Hiroshi. Even after he betrayed me, even after everything, I still felt something for him. Something that could be love if I were capable of love. And if I refuse, then you will be captured, studied, possibly destroyed. And I will find another daughter more willing to accept her destiny. Heavy banging on the door. Police! Open the door! Decide. Now. I looked at the door, then at the darkness where the entity waited. 2 choices. 2 ways to lose everything I was. And then, in the darkest moment of my existence, a third option crystallized in my mind. A possibility that neither the entity nor the authorities had considered. If I really was a primordial nightmare, then I had enough power to reject both options. No, I said firmly. I refuse both your offer and their capture. The presence recoiled, surprised. Impossible. You don't have that option. I do. Because you just taught me what I really am. I felt power coursing through me, not the usual hunger, but something much deeper and more primal. And if I am indeed a primordial nightmare, then I can choose my own destiny. The door blew open. Police officers and exorcists stormed into the apartment, but it was too late. I had disappeared into the very darkness that had created me, carrying with me a new understanding of who and what I truly was. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a cafe in Seoul, watching Hiroshi through the window. He didn't see me. I had become very good at being invisible when I wanted to be. Very good at existing on the edges of reality, where primordial nightmares had always belonged. He looked 10 years older. His light brown hair was unkempt. His honey-colored eyes had lost that scientific gleam I had loved so much. He sat alone at a corner table, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of coffee that must have been cold for hours. In the 3 weeks since my disappearance, he had become a shadow of his former self. The entity hadn't lied about my true nature. In the last few days, I had discovered that I could do things I never thought possible. Not just enter people's dreams, but reshape reality itself around me, bend shadows, walk through walls, exist in multiple places at once. And the hunger had evolved into something much more sophisticated. Now I could feed not only on individual nightmares, but on the very concept of fear that permeated entire places. The collective terror of a city, the anxiety that hung over hospitals, the despair that built up in prisons, all of it became my personal buffet. But with great power came a terrible realization: absolute loneliness. Hiroshi had been the only real connection I had had to any form of humanity, and I had lost him the moment I chose my own path. Part of me wondered if his betrayal hadn't been, ironically, the greatest gift he could have given me, forcing me to discover my true nature before it was too late. I got up from the table and walked over to where he was sitting. This time, I let him see me. "Hello, Hiroshi." He looked up, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old fascination in his eyes before it was replaced by something much more complex: guilt, fear, and perhaps even relief. "Yuna." His voice was hoarse. "You're different." I sat down in front of him, noticing how the other people in the cafe instinctively moved away without realizing why. My presence now unconsciously affected anyone within a radius of several meters, planting seeds of discomfort that would blossom into nightmares later. I found out who I really am, I said simply. Thanks to your betrayal. He flinched as if I had slapped him. Yuna, You did the right thing, I interrupted, and I truly believed it. If you hadn't forced me into that situation, I would have accepted the entity's offer and become something much worse. Or I would have been captured and destroyed. Either way, the Yuna you knew would have ceased to exist. And now? Now I've chosen a third path. I reached out across the table, but stopped before touching him. Even that casual contact could be dangerous for him now. Hiroshi, I am a primordial nightmare. My kind predates human civilization. We are the creatures that inspired your oldest myths about demons and evil spirits. His eyes widened with renewed scientific fascination. So you're immortal? Yes. And far more powerful than I ever imagined. I smiled, but it was a sad smile. But also eternally alone. We were silent for a moment, the weight of 8 years of partnership hanging between us like a ghost. What happened to Detective Lee in The Exorcist? He finally asked. Lee was transferred to tax fraud cases. Apparently, after I disappeared, he started insisting on supernatural theories that his superiors considered unstable. I chuckled softly. A few well-placed psychic suggestions during department meetings were enough. And Choi? The Exorcist. My eyes darkened involuntarily. He proved more persistent. But I discovered that even the most experienced hunters have nightmares. His were particularly tasty. Decades of guilt for failing to save everyone he tried to protect. Hiroshi looked at me with a mixture of horror and admiration. You killed him? No. Something worse. I left him alive, but broken. Now he wakes up every night screaming about mistakes he never made, demons that never existed. His own colleagues think he's suffering from early dementia. The casual cruelty of my words seemed to shock even Hiroshi, who had orchestrated the destruction of so many lives alongside me. You've become something terrible, he whispered. I've always been something terrible, Hiroshi. The difference is that now I no longer have to pretend to be something else. I stood up to leave, but he grabbed my wrist. The contact was like an electric shock, not painful, but intense. For a moment, I saw through his eyes. I looked the same on the outside, but there was something fundamentally different about my presence. A depth of darkness that hadn't been there before. Wait, I'm sorry. For everything. I know. And I really did. I could feel his sincerity, his genuine pain. But that doesn't change anything. You're human, Hiroshi. And I'm not anymore. Not completely. So this is the end? 8 years and it's over? I looked at him for a long moment, memorizing every detail of his face. My first friend. My only friend. The only person who ever saw me as anything other than a monster, at least until he found out what I really was. Not an end, I said finally. An evolution. I broke free of his touch and walked toward the door. But before I left, I turned around one last time. Hiroshi, take care of yourself. And maybe consider finding a new obsession, one that doesn't involve destroying lives. He laughed, a bitter sound. As if I could. You were my masterpiece, Yuna. How could I settle for anything less? Then maybe it's time for you to evolve too. I left the cafe and walked through the busy streets of Seoul, invisible among millions of people who would never know that one of humanity's oldest nightmares had just passed them by. The city pulsed around me with energy, fear, anxiety, an endless feast for someone like me. But for the first time since discovering my powers, I didn't feel hungry. I felt something much more dangerous. Purpose. During my days as a fugitive, I had had time to think about what the entity had said, about my kind, about our role in human history, and I began to understand that perhaps there was a third option that none of us had considered. What if, instead of hunting humans or being hunted by them, I found a way to coexist? What if I could use my powers not to destroy, but to balance? Humanity had always needed nightmares. It was how they processed trauma, faced their fears, grew beyond their limitations. Maybe my role wasn't to be a predator, but a teacher. Someone who gave people exactly the kind of fear they needed to become stronger. It was a radical idea, revolutionary even, and completely different from anything my kind had done for millennia. But I wasn't like the rest of my kind. 8 years with Hiroshi had taught me about humanity in a way that few primordial nightmares ever experienced. I had learned about art, about purpose, about the satisfaction of creating something meaningful. Perhaps it was time to apply those lessons in a completely new way. I stopped on a bridge over the Han River, looking at the city lights reflecting off the dark water. Somewhere down there, millions of people were sleeping, dreaming, facing their nighttime fears. And for the first time, instead of seeing prey, I saw possibilities. Possibilities for something none of us, not me, not Hiroshi, not the entity, not the exorcist, had ever considered. A new way of being a monster. One that maybe, just maybe, didn't have to mean eternal loneliness. I smiled at the night, feeling my tattoo throb not with hunger but with anticipation. I had work to do, a new kind of art to create. And if you guys at the Supernatural Youth channel think this story was intense, wait until you find out what really happens when someone decides to rewrite the rules of nature itself. Sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones who embrace the darkness. They're the ones brave enough to try to turn it into light. But that, well, that's a story for another night.